Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Eric. Today I'm going to talk about the 1986 film Highlander. You can see there Christopher Lambert on the front of the poster. Um, you can argue whether this is a science fiction film or not, and there's many genres in this film that I'll talk about, so maybe it's not a straight up science fiction film, but I thought I would include it just as a really interesting genre film of the mid 1980s. So this film was directed by Russell Mulcahy, who was an Australian director. Started out directing music videos, and there's a real music video aesthetic in Highlander that's really done well. Just some really fantastic shots, and the editing is really great. There's so many really interesting juxtapositions in this film. I'll talk about those. So the direction I was impressed by. And yeah, and the fact that it blends together genres where you might think this is a time travel film if you watch the trailers or if you're not familiar with it. And in some ways it is a time travel film, but it's not in the sense where they're using technology to move back and forth through time like Back to the Future or something like that. This is about the lead character is immortal, and he has lived in many different time periods, and the film jumps around through these different eras. So in that sense, it's a time travel film from the perspective of characters who are immortal. And Christopher Lambert plays Connor MacLeod, a Scotsman who discovers that he's an immortal, and the film's really about him, how he chooses to live, but he's also in a desperate struggle with others who are immortals and pose a threat to humanity. So there's a real existential aspect to the film. Sean Connery is in here as Ramirez, who plays like the mentor to Lambert, and I'll talk more about his character. And we have Clancy Brown as the villain, very memorable as the Kurgan in the film. Roxanne Hart as plays Brenda, a forensic scientist in modern New York City. So those are the real principles in this cast of Highlander. I should talk about what inspired the film a little bit. And the screenwriter Gregory Wyden talked about visiting the Tower of London and seeing all of the swords. I've never been there, but seeing all of the historical items on display, and the idea came into his head of what if you were an immortal person and you were able to accumulate all of these materials throughout history, like what would your house look like? So that was the immediate idea. Also, two movies often come up in my research that inspired this. One was Barry Lyndon, the Stanley Kubrick film from 1975, which is set in 18th century Europe, and really just this immersive film about following the lead character and through his various adventures. And also The Duelist, which came out in 1977, which was Ridley Scott's debut film, which is about two soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars who have a series of duels, very bloody duels, sword fight duels throughout. And and The Duelist is a really cool movie if you've not seen it. And so those were the two main influences on Highlander, which are great influences. So a little bit about the story, So we have Connor, the main character, and the structure of this film, I should mention, where we're jumping back and forth through different time periods. So it's really not until we get into the middle of the film where we get the big exposition of what exactly is going on. The film starts out, we're at a professional wrestling match in modern New York City in Madison Square Garden. And then we're jumping back to a medieval battle in Scotland, but just the juxtaposition of the spectacle of the wrestling and the medieval battle is really cool. But the film is doing that all the time. I mean, the set designs is one of the best of the 80s, and just how incredible some of the shots are throughout this film. But with the story, we learn that Connor, he is a soldier warrior with his Scottish clan, and he is killed in battle, and discovers that he recovers from his wounds, and he's actually immortal. And when his village, they thought he was dead, and he comes back, he resurrects, and they think he's some sort of demon or something. So he's cast out of his village, and he has to live alone. He eventually marries a woman, Heather, I believe was her name. And they have a life together. And then he meets up with Sean Connery, who is also an immortal, Ramirez, a Spaniard who speaks with a Scottish accent. It's fantastic, and kind of schools McLeod on the Immortals and the whole, the world building and the exposition that we need from the film. But Connery is just such a charming presence throughout this, and we get to see him do sword fights and dish out wisdom, everything we want from Sean Connery in a movie like this. And we learned that these immortal, there's like the good immortals and the bad ones, and they are in this battle where the bad ones pose a threat to the mortals. So there's this mystical side to the story. And the Kurgan, who's played by Clancy Brown, I should mention, who's a great villain, very memorable, has some funny lines, really over the top villain. I know originally he was supposed to be a more complicated villain, who was maybe more of an anti-hero type, but the script went into more of a over the top direction with the character, and maybe that was the right thing to do. But anyway, very memorable. So that's the story, and we're, like we said, the genre blending where the scenes of New York City feel like a neo-noir from the 80s with the cop procedurals and just so many smoke-filled streets, and New York City, it really feels like a very atmospheric film set in a modern city. And kind of like Ridley Scott with Blade Runner, it kind of has a little bit of that vibe to it. And then going back to Scotland, and then to some of the other places, there's a flashback to World War II. There's a flashback to the American Revolution. So there's different time periods that we get snippets of. And it's also really ultimately, the film though is a love story. There's a strong gothic quality to it, where Connor is really a haunted character because he had to watch his first wife age as he did not age, and he's sort of brokenhearted, and he's unable to love again. So there's that gothic aspect. In World War II, he saves a little girl from these horrible Nazis, and I guess sort of adopts her as his daughter, but in the modern day New York City, she's now a middle-aged woman, so there's like a strange dynamic there where she seems to be in love with him, but there's this father-daughter thing. So there's that aspect of it as well. And then he does, with Brenda, who I mentioned, she kind of does the investigating in New York and discovers that he has a very strange past, and that he's probably been living a long time, the Roxanne Hart character. But just like I said, the sets, like he has a really incredible apartment, and he's an antique dealer is how he lives, and he has this incredible loft with all of these relics around him, and like once again that sense of the modern world and the more older Middle Ages world, that kind of the two aesthetics are kind of blending throughout, which is a lot of fun. So yeah, the themes I talked about, the love story theme, the immortality theme, the pain, the existential angst of being immortal. This film does a really fantastic job of exploring those ideas. So it's just a memorable film. Great scene in the cathedral with Clancy Brown having some interesting interactions there. So it's just really many memorable scenes and moments, and the sword fighting, and the sword fighting scenes do have a purpose. Like when two immortals engage in combat, there's actually real stakes to it. So the film does a good job of doing that. But once again, modern New York City sword fights with these broadswords, once again, very that idea of juxtapositioning two different eras. Yeah, so Highlander, just a few more things to say. This had a soundtrack by Queen, provided songs for the film, and some memorable songs, A Kind of Magic, and songs like that. Michael Kamen did this really bombastic orchestral score to gives the film a real epic quality to it. So memorable music. The fact this film didn't do so well at the box office, and I don't know with Highlander, I know I was listening to the Projection Booth podcast, and they were saying how in the 80s in America, I was a little young then, but how it was a popular rental among high school age students. So it did have a following in America, but I always got the sense this film was maybe more popular in the UK and Europe, but I could be wrong there. Maybe the fan base is a bit stronger across the Atlantic. But the idea of a movie, we see this more and more during this era in the mid 80s, where a film finds its audience on VHS, right? And while the theatrical experience was still supreme in the 1980s, it is kind of a new thing where people are willing to maybe not go to the theater, but willing to watch the movie at home. And that's really in those home viewings where a film finds its audience. And of course, TV had kind of done that same thing in the 50s, but we're starting to see that a little bit more, a new trend that would only grow and grow as we get into the 21st century. So that's an interesting little side note to Highlander. I mentioned the Projection Booth podcast I've mentioned before did a really good episode on Highlander, and I should mention an article by Priscilla Page, where she wrote a really good analysis of Highlander. She really got into some of the more philosophical aspects of the film, and so I would highly recommend reading that. I'll post that in my notes for this video, but yeah, I would definitely highly recommend an article by Priscilla Page. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Highlander. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.